Number 10, D-Day, laying lots of pipe. D-Day was a day that the Allies had been preparing for so many years. June 6, 1944 was the beginning of the end for fascist tyranny in Europe. Composed of landing spots in Normandy, France, were Utah, Omaha, Juneau, that's ours, Gold, and Sword. The idea was to finally punch through the mustache man's Atlantic wall and get a foothold in occupied Europe. Thousands of lives were lost in a matter of hours. Crazy battle. However, something I think is very interesting and a battle that no one really talks about is the logistics battle of D-Day. Seriously, the amount of stuff that had to happen or to be put in place in order for the invasion to commence was insane. One example of this is the pipeline that would fuel Allied vehicles once the invasion had been successful. Starting in 1942, the pipe was being laid. Eventually, it would extend over 100 miles into France and Europe to supply the war effort. Crazy what we'll do for a little gas.
Number 9. Battle of Zappolino. Turning the calendars back to 1325, the Battle of Zappolino was a large-scale event over a bucket. Like a pail, like a literal wooden, I'm not even joking here. The War of the Oaken Bucket, that's what it's also referred to as. This war consisted of two Italian towns, Bologna and Modena. They all went head to head, and it kicked off when soldiers from Modena snuck into Bologna with intentions to steal the town's wooden bucket from the city's well. How horrible is that? I mean, resources were pretty sparse back then, so this was actually like a really big deal to do that. The Bolognese declared war immediately and sent in an invading force of 30,000 foot soldiers and 2,000 cavaliers. The city of Medina had a smaller army. They had only 500 infantrymen and 2,000 cavalry forces. Thing is, these guys still won. They chased the larger army back to Bologna while destroying towns in the process. Some recall them bringing the bucket back just to taunt the city. They came back like, oh, you want this bucket, eh? And they started smacking it with spoons and they just left again. The bucket is currently and still on display in Medina. If you want to go see it, go take a look. That took so many lives. That many people kicked the bucket over this bucket. History is strange.
Number 8, Operation Cottage. If you heard the title Operation Cottage and thought that maybe Canadians were involved in the process, then you would be correct. Unfortunately, this was a battle between Canadians and Americans during WW2. Back in 1942, Imperial Japanese Marines had landed a force in Alaska at Kisika Island. That alone was terrifying. You know, they were so close. America and Canada, finding out about this, were naturally alarmed. So in 1943, they sent some men to take care of the issue. When the Allies landed, a firefight ensued. Naturally, it's WW2, it happens. And both Canadians and Americans had casualties. The trouble is, it wasn't the Japanese. They had abandoned their post a few weeks earlier, as they deemed it was too difficult to defend, and it's Alaska. It's too cold. Anyone from that area could tell you the same. As it turns out, it was Americans and Canadians firing upon each other in a case of mistaken identity, or not so friendly fire.
Number 7, Combat of the 30. Also known as Combat des Trente, you can say that if you're feeling fancy of course, but the Combat of the 30, easier for me to say, took place during the Breton War of Succession. This was back in 1351. This battle was arranged beforehand, you know, bring your shiniest armor and your most golden gal and meet me at the battlefield at Brittany. Throw a little note in. And then both sides had 30 champions. They had their best knights come forth in all the land and they just fought it out. One side represents the King of England, the other the King of France. This whole thing was arranged by one guy, a captain in the French banner named Jean de Bonmanior. This event pulled in a crowd. Drinks were literally served throughout the audience. This fight lasted a very long time. Hours went by and 4 French knights had fallen as well as 2 Englishmen. So they started taking breaks. Yeah, like a common sporting event now. By the end of the whole thing, the English surrendered after losing 9 knights and the French in total lost 6. And nobody tipped the servers. All bad.
Number 6, the battle for Castle Itter. Wehrmacht versus SS. May 5th, 1945 was the final act of WW2, or really the last few days in Europe. So when American soldiers came across a Wehrmacht detachment defending an Austrian castle full of high-value targets from some other Germans who hadn't seen the big picture yet, yeah, it was going to be crazy. So the Americans joined forces with these renegade Germans to help defend the castle. I'm gonna call on Hollywood again here. Come on guys, this one just writes itself. The ensuing battle was very hectic as ammo was running dry and becoming something of a nail-biter, when finally reinforcements showed up to rescue the motley crew. What made Germans turn against Germans? Was it 5 years of WW2? Maybe it was hunger, grief, or maybe they were just fed up with Mustache Man. Either way, it makes for a great story and shows that not everyone is terrible. The enemy of mine enemy is mine friend.
Number 5, the Battle of Los Angeles. Of course, we have to mention one of the most unspeakable battles of all time, the Battle of LA, otherwise known as the Great LA Air Raid. It happened during World War II at the end of February 1942. This event, first of all, took place only a few months after the Pearl Harbor attack, so everybody was obviously immensely stressed out. Something like 25 enemy aircraft was spotted flying over LA in the late hours of February 24th, so air raids went off. Blackouts were now in effect. This was not a drill, right? Or was it? Artillery fire, machine guns, anti-aircraft shells, in total around 1,400 shells were blasted off. 2 people had heart attacks. 5 people in total died from this retaliation, and it was indeed a false alarm. A press conference was held by Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, and he called the incident war nerves. Yeah, just nerves. Ha, whoopsies, thought I heard a noise. Meow, oops, sorry about your heart attacks.
Number 4, the Emu War. Australia, a land of beautiful landscapes, sunshine, and an accent that I'm trying to master. It's not that easy. All crocodile hunters aside, they are infamous for a battle of biblical proportions, something that was so huge and magnificent it for sure had to be talked about. It's the Emu War. Yes, that's right, the Aussies went to war with emus, and they lost. Okay, hold on. Before I get blooming onions thrown at me, let me explain. Basically, the Great Depression was hard for Australia. It was hard for everybody, but especially them. It was rough. Even rougher was emus destroying their crops. Really bad. So bad, the farmers called upon the government, who then called upon the army, who then called upon a couple of dudes with a truck and a machine gun to deal with it. Trouble is, they were just too darn good at dodging gunfire. The emus, that is. One politician jokingly said, the emus should be given medals for their bravery. I don't even know about that one. I don't even know. That's just, okay, they missed. I guess they missed.
Number 3, the War of Jenkins' Ear. Not to be confused with the War of Holyfield's Ear, that was a bit more recent. The Jenkins' Ear War took place in 1731, when a British trader, Robert Jenkins, was accused by Spanish authorities of being a smuggler. Reminder, this is 1731, so everybody was like, okay, you said it, therefore it must be the truth. And so they seized all his belongings, and to make matters somehow worse, they cut off his ear. Now cut to 8 years later, the British are now brainstorming, just looking for a reason to attack Spain and then, force them out of the Caribbean. So they launched this big attack and over 25,000 lost their lives. Disease was to blame for most of that body count, so if you're gonna avenge your ear, wash your hands. In the meantime, I don't know, just an idea.
Number 2, Navy cheese. I can't lie to you guys, there's a part of me that would love to get into a time machine and join the Royal Navy in its prime, sailing the sea for Her Royal Majesty and getting into naval battles, just like you see in the movies. Or me, Pirate Captain Chetty, imagine that. Would also be pretty sick, and Captain Chetty and maybe Helmsman McWaters. It's all fun and games until wheels of cheese start causing mortal wounds. Wait, what did I just say? Yeah, during a naval skirmish between Brazil and Uruguay, things were getting a little out of hand. Brazil, having the superior navy, wasn't worried. Who cares? And besides, the enemy had just run out of cannonballs. What could they do to us? Before they could bust out the champagne and celebrate, however, the Uruguay ship fired back with wheels of cheese. And it worked very well. It destroyed a lot more than the Brazilian ship would like to admit, and was forced to retreat. Getting destroyed by cheese is not going to look good on the report.
And finally, number 1, the Battle of the Stray Dog. I grew up with dogs my entire life. I love dogs, but it's stressful at times. You open the door to look at a mailman for a split second, and all of a sudden your furry friend is running down the street after a blue jay. It's not easy. Now I'm running in my socks at 9 a.m. It's no good for anyone. Since the Second Balkan War in the early 1900s, Greece and Bulgaria were going head to head. A lot of conflict, a lot of emotions, tensions are high. Come October 1925, things escalated and exploded. A Greek soldier was chasing after his dog, who just decided to bolt randomly, as dogs do, but in doing so, he accidentally crossed the border into Bulgaria, so he was shot at. The Greeks at that point were beyond upset, so they marched into Bulgaria, and so began a full-on war. By the time the International Committee negotiated a ceasefire to, clear up the obvious misunderstanding that happened here, 50 people had already lost their lives. So Keep those leashes on, folks. That's all I'm saying.
Let's start at the beginning. How gladiators got going. The notion of gladiators originated with the Etruscans, who preceded the Romans in central Italy. Traditionally, when an Etruscan leader died, as part of the funeral ceremony, a pair of warriors sometimes, fought to the death with their bare hands to honor his warlike spirit. Normal stuff. But over time, this practice becomes institutionalized, and the Romans subsequently imitate it in a more digestible way to them, while simultaneously distancing themselves from the savagery of the Etruscans. Throughout the next 800 years of the Roman Republic, gladiator games remained infrequent on a small scale and only held as part of a funeral service for those of high rank. That practice began to change in the late Republic. Julius Caesar put on a gladiatorial show that featured 320 pairs of gladiators in honor of his father, who'd already been dead for 20 years. Seems like nobody important died recently, and Julius really had a hankering for a gore show. From then on, the gladiator games thrown by him made the younger Caesar popular with the people of Rome. One notable exhibition took place in 216 BC, when 22 fights were held over 3 days to mark the death of a prominent senator. From boo-hoo to yahoo, tradition to entertainment. In ancient Rome, it was tradition for the state to provide entertainment using two categories: lude, meaning theatrical performances, dances, and chariot races and other creative pursuits. Then there's monera, or spectacle, such as wild animal shows, death sentences, and other unusual exhibitions. The Romans' concept of entertainment was that most of these events had a religious component, held on religious days, accompanied by prayers and sacrifices, a way of paying homage to the gods. As mentioned, gladiators started out as a weird funerary rite, and Julius segues them into the everyday by having a big melee, so now boom, they're suddenly part of monera. There is scholarly debate if this is truly from public demand alone, or if the gladiatorial games being used as distractions that kept the people subdued so they were just hardcore promoted in the village. Some argue that the game reflected the typical Roman virtues such as courage, endurance, and martial skill, while others, like Roman satirist Juvenal, thought that the games preyed on the Roman unhealthy obsessions with bread and circuses, aka blood sport. In Rome, death sentences and ritual killings were a way of keeping the peace and showing the Romans who boss was. The arena was the next step, an advancement in societal distraction used to entertain the lower class citizens of Rome, but at the same time uniting them together in an uphold of societal rules. Think this is horrific? May I turn your attention to rugby, hockey, and basketball, three sports notorious for hardcore hits and the spilling of blood. Think of audience reaction when a fight breaks out, when a tooth goes flying, when someone lands a dirty hit. Yeah, not so archaic, is it? Thank God though, because it all came at the price of celebrity status. And yeah, it's still a price if your social rank remains that of a gutter rat. Your reminder that gladiators, no matter how esteemed, were lumped into the social ladder with working girls and heretics. Though often dismissed as uncivilized brutes by Roman historians and aristocracy, traditionally the gladiators won massive fame amongst the lower classes. So much that a name was coined for their ancient fangirl gaggles, ludiae, or training school girls, coined by Juvenal once again. Gladiator portraits graced the walls of many public places. Children played with gladiator action figures made of clay, and the most successful of fighters even endorsed products like today's app. Many women wore jewelry glazed in their blood and mixed some of their sweat into some of their cosmetics. I'll dare any one of you guys watching to walk onto an NBA court and try and get some LeBron sweat for your next face mask. We know that gladiators were private citizens with a life sentence, people overwhelmed by debt, criminals, and occasionally free men attracted to the arena by promises of riches and honors. They never lost their community connections though when becoming a gladiator, and those who managed to make a killing at it, pun intended, have been documented to heavily give back to communities they came from, free enslaved individuals, and support the economy. One of the ways they could do that was brotherhoods, because anyone who wasn't nobility had a pretty good sense as to what the Roman day-to-day was like, so they knew if everyone was already against them, their class, and had no intention to raise them above said stereotype, then howdy doody, they'll just support their own lives and economies while the royal ladies fetishize them and the royal kids admire them. Yes, regularly they would be throwing down in life or death combat against one another, but gladiators viewed themselves as a kind of brotherhood and often took it upon themselves to organize into collegia with their own elected leaders and chosen protector deity from the wide pantheon of available gods. When a warrior fell in battle, these groups would ensure that their comrade received a proper funeral and grave inscription honoring his achievements in the arena. The same can be said for grievous injuries. Pooled union money could go towards a surgery or recovery or medicine moment of dire need. If the deceased had a wife or children, they would also see the family receive monetary compensation for their loss. This tradition protected their own, their community, and the fallen. And as you could guess, injuries and fatalities are pretty common in a battle of contrast. Gladiator battles had a lot of overlooked details and facets that don't bleed over into common conversation. You can have a whole conversation about what gladiators would wear while duking it out with his enemies without understanding why. It goes back to one word: tradition. Shocking, seeing as it's literally in the name of the video. The Romans liked a battle of contrast, matching a heavily armed and armored man against a lightly equipped and more barren opponent. It's supposed to be like some Tom and Jerry, one big broody type throwing everything he can, including the monkey wrench, at the lighter, smaller man who runs in circles around him. I am essentially telling you that the Romans set up their death games similar to how we set up cartoons. Yeah, I am. Big plot device came from all this blood sport lunacy. Chunky, slow moving. You sure you don't want some veggies there, Barley Boy? I'm just kidding. Also, gladiators are dead now, so I can't hurt their feelings. Besides, Barley Boy was a real title for the cranky tough guys. Researchers who studied 2,000-year-old skeletal remains of 67 gladiators were able to test them for certain elements, including calcium and zinc. Using scientific method of isotopic analysis, they can reconstructed the diets of the gladiators and discovered that they ate a plant-based, carb-rich diet that included barley and beans, very little animal protein. They also drank calcium supplements made from charred plants. Unlike the modern-day vegan who follows this kind of diet out of ethical motivations or being raised by the nothing tastes better than thin generation mom, gladiators evidently did it for pragmatic reasons. The diet was so curated and consistent that even with different dishes and spices, their diet was consistent enough to be called, you guess it, tradish. Love the puns. Gladiators fell into eating a lot of simple carbs to boost subcutaneous fat, which helped increase their survival chances in battle. Because of this fatty cushion, their blood vessels and nerves were better protected in fights. Whether or not they knew all the big sciencey words to explain it, I couldn't tell you, but they clearly picked up on it. That's what made this become such an indoctrinated diet for the gladiator. It was consistently proven to work, be efficient, and produce results. Besides, meat was for the rich anyway. Thankfully, gladiator medicine evolved after Greece fell to Rome, meaning it was time for some Greek training. The Roman gladiatorial games were a far cry from the Olympic and theatrical pursuits enjoyed in ancient Greece, but the Greeks played an important role in preparing gladiators for their violent contests. After their incorporation into the Roman Empire, the ancient Greeks quickly carved out a little niche for themselves in a multitude of professions. Greek philosophers were employed to educate the sons of wealthy Roman aristocrats, merchants took advantage of the Pax Romana to sell their goods far and wide, and the chefs and bakers got to really blow some sandals off. For Greek athletes and physicians, Roman rule offered other opportunities. Gladiators, who required training and medical care, and the Greeks had the requisite skills to provide them. Their role might have been similar to that of a strength and conditioning coach employed to help modern athletes today. By this time, the ancient Greeks had spent centuries refining their strength and conditioning practices for the Olympics and other games, so the Greek trainers were perfect for this role. They understood kinesiology, diet, regime, all the things that gladiators had been lacking before them. The most comprehensive primary source on gladiator medical care comes from Galen, a Greek physician, surgeon, and philosopher who in 167 AD returned to his native city of Pergamon to work as a physician to the gladiators of the High Priest of Asia. According to the historian of medicine, Vivian Nutton, only 2 gladiators died when Galen was operating in Pergamon, whereas 60 had been killed in the tenure of his predecessor. Galen's experience treating wounds and sometimes dying gladiators provided opportunities for medical discoveries. He disproved Aristotle's assertion that the heart was the seat of the reason by observing a dying gladiator who sustained mortal wounds to the heart remained lucid until death. And while having a robust body may save your life, a pretty face sells the case. There were several types of gladiators, the distinctions based on the type of weaponry and tactics, but the most beautiful gladiators were held in high esteem. When the opponents for a gladiator were chosen, their beauty was taken into account. Ugliness ruined the lustrous fascination with viciousness, while beauty simultaneously emphasized the pain of mortality. Real artsy-fartsy, these Romans. The Rotarius, a gladiator fighting with equipment resembling that of a fisherman, was the least armed combatant in the arena, armed with a trident, a dagger, a net. A Rotarius wore nothing but a loincloth, a belt, and a minimal amount of armor. He was considered inferior to other gladiators, literally dubbed unnecessary to kill, and there was an aspect of homosexuality and effeminacy to his appearance and role in battle. He was to represent the ardent love of soft masculine beauty in Roman Greece, placed in the plight of human disgust and sin. Thus, Rotarius would stand out in battle but not be crucial to it. Since Rotarius is not really high on the list of gladiator discussion piles, I'll leave you with Satire 2 and 8, wherein writer Juvenal described Gratius, a man who disgraced himself by becoming the male bridegroom to a horn player. Not the disgrace here, but Juvenal was a massive hater and everyone knows it. A lot of sexist tirades. However, that marriage, like said, was not the embarrassing moment. It was when he fought by choice and effed up his one job as Rotarius, which was to throw the net at the guy. He missed the throw like an effing idiot and was forced to run for his life. Even Grashi, his opponent, was ashamed to be fighting him. Here's a crazy one, name based off defeat. Hey, to cut all the preamble and get right to it, they literally named all their categories of gladiator types after places they conquered. That's it, that's the show, pack it up, and good night everyone. These gladiators would then fight with some Romanized versions of their traditional weapons and fighting styles, and were sometimes also given a gladiatorial category due to being ethnic themselves, as it was a great way to show off how un-Roman you were when chosen to be an opponent. In creating gladiators of this type to fight for them, the Romans tried to mark out those in the ring as different than them and more deserving of the humiliation of fighting for others' entertainment. So let's learn about a few categories. The people of Gaul, which had roughly covered modern France and Belgium, proved to be a formidable foe to Rome, as demonstrated when they plundered the city in 390 BCE. They were feared by the Romans until conquered by Julius Caesar, and then Gaul became deeply integrated into the empire and as being a wealthy province and provided many members to the Roman elite. So the gladiator was actually renamed the Murmillo to reflect the changing attitude later on. Another type of gladiator was called the Hoplomaches, and he was modeled off the hoplite, the quintessential soldier of the Greek antiquity. They were equipped with a sword, a spear, and a round shield. The Romans encountered the Thracians, who lived in the southeast Balkans between Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey, and to the Romans they were wild and savage, so they modeled that gladiator, the Thrax, as such, with a small rectangular shield, 2 leg greaves, a curved simcar, and a bunch of other weapons. Emperor Caligula was fond of appearing as a Thracian fighter. In his case, it's hard to know if he picked that type as an ethnic connotation or because they were just super cool and scary. And last but never least, who is surprised to hear that traditionally women got the short stick? Literally, they were given short sticks sometimes. Why? Even though we have a very limited history of female gladiators, it can tell us that they were hardcore B-word brawls that put men to shame at first, and transitioned into a spectacle more on par with 2 sorority girls jello wrestling in bikinis. Female gladiators are gladiatrix in modern language, while ancient texts referred to them as Ludia or Molières, weren't as common as their male counterparts, but they did make their way into the ring. They were highly sexualized. Female gladiators only wore loincloths as opposed to the tunics men wore, and they were not given helmets, presumably to show off their faces and hairstyles. Fights featuring female gladiators represented the pinnacle of luxury and indulgence, often present at private parties held by the Roman elite. Unlike their male counterparts, who were often forced into the gladiator life, it's believed gladiatrix chose to fight for financial gain, honor, spite, or fame. Although evidence to support the historical existence isn't vast, it's compelling. Written and archaeological records have survived, including a marble relief and funerary items. One statue, believed to depict a female gladiator, features a bare-chested woman holding a sika, associated with a type of gladiator known as the Thrax. Further substantiating the history of female gladiators is a law that barred free women from participating in the arena games if they were 20 years or younger. The creation of this law was seen as an inadvertent recognition of the fact that women had been participating already. Male gladiators, however, kept hacking away at each other for another 2 centuries before the last recorded gladiatorial contest occurred in 404 AD. The fight between these 2 women, the goddess Achilles and the queen of an Amazon warrior tribe, survives as an interesting example of a serious female contest. An ancient marble relief, now in the British Museum, naturally, shows that these 2 women fought well and respectively and were both granted their freedom at the end of it.
Number 10. The Jaguar Warrior. Mesoamerica, a beautiful ancient place full of culture, wonder, and civilization. If you're a Spanish conquistador, then the most important thing there is riches, gold. There's lots of gold there. Tons and tons of riches. However, something some folks may not know about is a very powerful warrior the Aztecs had, the Jaguar Warrior. RAR XD. Don't ever do that again, sorry. that's just the worst. Yes, and just as vicious as it sounds, the Aztecs had no standing army, so most men were kind of just trained to be warriors just in case. The Jaguar Warrior was a fierce warrior who proved his salt by capturing 4 enemies. And only then he would be classified as such. Now, why is capturing enemies so important, you may ask? Well, it's so you have a plentitude of sacrifices to make when the gods ask you for some. Oh yes, they do this in full dress too, sometimes even wearing a jaguar skin on their head and their backs. It's kind of weird. Just keep your eyes out for those ones, folks. Keep your eyes out in the jungle, you never know. Number 9. Spartan. Did you really think I wasn't going to mention Spartans when talking about the most powerful warriors in history? Sparta, another beautiful ancient place full of culture and wonder. Sadly, these were times of great battles and none were better than the Spartans at this. Complete with their Agog training, Spartans were bred for this kind of butter. Working as a unit with a group of Falnac strategy made them extremely effective. Complete with their shield spear and short Zepho sword, the Spartans were a formidable fighting force, and the bravest of warriors. You only have to look at the examples like the Battle of Thermopylae to have this make sense, and the movie 300. I love those painted on abs, you gotta love them, right? Number 8. Samurai. Anime fans rejoice, because I have now mentioned samurai, all is well. Where would we be without the samurai and his katana? I don't know honestly, but they are warriors not to be trifled with, I do know that. The samurai were a unique class of warrior, and in the beginning, they were paid to protect the goods of those who could not afford such services. But eventually they became so wealthy that they became a noble class of their own, and their boss sort of became the leader of a fractured nation. The emperors are still there, but the shoguns, they're the ones in charge. Kinda like your mom and dad at home. Yeah, dad's there, he shows up, but mom runs the show. We know how it goes. They followed a code of honor and did whatever to uphold that. Cunning warriors and excellent swordsmanship, as well as archers and horse riders. They were so cool that it gave George Lucas an idea back in the 1970s to base the Jedi around them. If that's not cool, I don't know what is. The samurai ruled for hundreds of years, with their share of victories and defeats. Number 7. Ninja. The warrior that goes bump in the night. The reason why dudes with my proportion thinks warriors in black cloaks running on rooftops with frog-toed shoes are cool. I know, nice. The ninja, stealth and espionage expert, and maybe the first to do so. The ninja were a group of mercenaries in the 15th century Japan, or at least got their start in 15th century Japan, who rose to prominence as the guys you hire when you need some shady stuff done. The battles between samurai and ninja are noteworthy to say the least. However, the fact that more often than not, instead of fighting the samurai often hired the ninjas to do their dirty work. Corruption, theft, sabotage, and just some good old-fashioned spying. Good old stuff. This sneaking around was accompanied by some excellent fighting tactics and dastardly weaponry to go along with it. The black egg in particular gives me nightmares. It's kind of like when you got something stuck in your eye and you just can't get it out, except it's not an eyelash. It's a little egg that you throw at people's faces and it's filled with crushed glass. Ouch. I don't even know how you'd get that out in ancient times. There's no eye wash station, so you know what? Cut it. I ain't part of that one. Ain't doing it. Nope. Number 6. Flama. Here's something new I learned. That's how you know it's going to be a good video, folks. I actually learned something, I know. Flama was a Roman gladiator, perhaps of Syrian descent, or maybe Roman, we're not exactly sure. However, the story goes like this. The Roman Colosseum, big stands with big fans, maybe even some snacks too. It may be a blood sport, but you gotta have some grub. Personally, I'm a ballpark dog kind of guy. One shot of mustard, one shot of ketchup, please. Anyway, I digress. Flama was a very interesting gladiator. Unlike most others, he took part in a lot of battles, probably the most. And like a lot of others, he was taken to become a fighter at such a young age, so he could earn his freedom. So he fights for his freedom, that's kind of crazy. The thing with Flama is that he won 4 times. Won his freedom 4 times. And each time he refused and continued to fight. It's more of a, I'm not locked in here with you situation, you're locked in here with me situation. I'm good at Call of Duty sometimes, that's gotta count for something though, right? I'm not a gladiator, but I can play Call of Duty, that's good, right? Number 5, Alexander the Great. Everyone has ups and downs except for Alexander the Great. Besides a few skirmishes here and there, he was pretty much undefeated. That's a pretty good record. But he was like 10-0, and if this was Call of Duty Search and Destroy, that's good enough for me. The Macedonian prince's empire stretched thousands of miles from Greece to northern Africa, Persia, and even some parts of India. He accomplished all of this at a very, very young age. So, you know, get off your lazy butt and do something. That means me too. I just love being a homebody, what can I say? Although, I do enjoy the odd drinky poo with friends. Yeah. There's a famous quote, and I think this explains pretty much all of it. And Alexander wept, for he had no more worlds to conquer. Tragic. It's hard being a #1 top ancient warrior guy. It really is. It's really hard. Number 4, Mad Jack Churchill. This guy needs to be talked about more, man. He's so awesome. WW2. Germany was back for the sequel, and this time with its other tough guy friend Japan and their little paisano Italy. The boys were back in town and ready to party. Mad Jack Churchill got the invitation and brought some party favors with him. What did he bring, you're asking? Well, my fellow humble bumblebees, he brought a sword and a bow and bagpipes with him, which, if you didn't know, that's ancient stuff. but he brought it to a modern war. What? What's so weird about it? This is World War II. Swords and bows just aren't it anymore. They don't belong there. In fact, Mad Jack Churchill has the last recorded longbow D-Life in history. He has been noted to play Scotland the Brave when the enemy had him in their sights. He was captured multiple times and escaped multiple times, walking like thousands of miles to get out of there. Kind of crazy. When the war ended, he was genuinely upset it was over. He thought it was more of a game. Hollywood, if you're listening, someone make this movie or TV show. I'll play him. I'll do it. I'll come play in Scotland the Brave. Number 3, Genghis Khan. Sometimes in life you make an impact in history. Sometimes you do so much it's hard not to talk about you. Genghis got to write his own history. The ruthless and powerful warrior from the Mongol Empire. Basically, it goes down like this. You got something he wants, albeit land to camp on, people for his empire, or just riches in general. Now, while he deletes your village and kingdom, you got 2 options. Option 1, if you don't agree with the terms and conditions of option 2, then the chaos of option 1 continues. Or option 2, assimilate into our empire or refer to the consequences of option 1. Ooh, I'll take option 2 thanks, I like to live. But keep your religious freedom, though, for some reason. He let people keep their religious freedom, which is kind of cool. Even for a bloodthirsty monster, he was kind of cool with that. So gold star, buddy, gold star. And of course, the classic fact that he did so much bedroom stuff that his DNA is still with us today and has way too many descendants than we like to admit. That's just crazy, man. That's insanity. That's insanity. Number 2, Navy SEALs. Oh baby, some real slick frogmen. These are the guys that are sent behind enemy lines and gather vital intelligence. Some of the best. It doesn't get tougher than the Navy SEALs. Finding their roots in the Vietnam War, the Navy SEALs have been one of the toughest special forces the United States has ever seen. They've been involved in almost every major conflict the US has found themselves entangled with for the last 60 years. For me, when I think Navy SEALs, I think of the classic PS2 game. Remember that? Remember that game? I remember that game. It's pretty sick. Let's put that game back. The game was super ahead of its time. And number 1, Spits and Us. The spearhead of Russian special forces. These are tough guys with a tough history and ironically enough to mirror the history of the previously mentioned Navy SEALs. Getting their start as advisors to the VC in the Vietnam War and of course being a part of every major conflict the Soviet Union was a part of, and even the ones you may not know about. There's also a common rumor that the Spetsnaz trainees are given a pet. Sometimes it's a chicken or it's a dog, not too sure there, the information's not great, which kind of hurts the validity of the rumor, but the point stands nonetheless. Their duty is to basically raise and love and nurture this pet until an officer instructs them to take the pet to greener pastures. Yeah, no thanks. Number 10, Battle of LA. Remember the 1940s? Okay, well, maybe not. I mean, if you did, then you might not be watching this video, or you would need assistance from a strapping young grandson, such as myself, to help you with searching on the internet and whatnot. It's okay, I help the old people, that's what I do. Well, for the folks that didn't know, the world was at war, and passions were a little high. America, in a nutshell, said they weren't getting involved the second time around until Japan came, well, they kicked their sandcastle over. And by sandbox, I mean they made Pearl Harbor go boom. So naturally, a few months after the Pearl Harbor incident in February of 1942, the lovely west coast city of LA was put into shock and horror when unidentified flying objects appeared in the night sky. Air raid sirens blared and anti-aircraft artillery began to light up the night sky, as this was suspected to be a Japanese invasion. Well, it wasn't actually. It was actually a false alarm, so no need to panic, right? Maybe. Number 9, The Chosen Few. In the beginning of the Cold War, it was clear that the West had some spooky, scary communist enemies to deal with. And almost immediately after the world had sent Germany packing, the Soviet Union was acting up. And then China, and then Korea. Well, that was it. We had it. The West of America had enough of communism spreading. It was time to contain it. So American and UN forces went to Korea to have a discussion at the 38th parallel. One group of Marines at the Chosin Valley had a chewy perspective of the event. When this group of Marines at Chosin Valley radioed in for a supply drop, they used the code word Tootsie Rolls, as it was a code for mortar shells that they so desperately needed. Well, apparently the radio operator didn't get the memo and had an actual crate of Halloween's second least favorite candy scent. Besides candy corn, no one likes that stuff. But being the Marines, they used it to their advantage. And after being chewed up and placed over holes and gaps, the chocolatey treat made for a great filler, especially after freezing in the freezing cold weather at Chosen Valley. Cool story. Number 8. Jenkins' ear. The best way to describe life in the New World in the 18th century is aggressive corporate negotiations. The New World was full of plantations, trade, and YouTube's least favorite S word. So, also, naturally, the British Empire and its Royal Majesty wanted a slice of the Caribbean action. Trouble is, the Spanish had been there longer, and at the time, their presence was much more powerful. Well, the British had the means to de-Spanify the area, and all they really needed was a reason, because, you know, that makes war more palatable, right? Sure. Well, that's when they were presented with Robert Jenkins, a man who had his ear cut off by a bunch of Spanish thugs who raided his ship years prior. Turns out this was enough casus belli to start a war and fight over an ear. Hence the name, in English the war became the Battle of Jenkins' Ear. That's so weird. That's so strange. Imagine a guy, right, he's got his ear lobbed off. Time to go, let's go. I guess that's the reason, sure. Well, how long ago did this happen? It was like 10 years ago. Right, good enough for us, get packing. Number 7, Charge at Creasy. The Charge at Creasy can be described as a Hail Mary, one final push, the last card. It's a 1v6 and search and destroy on high rise in Modern Warfare 2. Bottom of the 9th and bases are loaded. If Hollywood has taught us anything in life, it's that these events always work out for our hero. Well, sometimes real life isn't like Hollywood movies. Take John of Bohemia for instance, your classic 1300s guy, marrying his way into royalty, a warrior, a knight, except poor John was blind in one eye due to a medical condition. Poor John. Well, at the Battle of Creasy, his bravery was put on full display. John had his horses tethered to other knights, because he was blind, as they made their last effort dash into the enemy, or charge if you will. They didn't make it. It didn't work out. Kinda crazy, like, right, I'm blind and what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna tie your horse to my horse and we're gonna run straight at the enemy. Number 6, Napoleon in Moscow. During the Corsican Ogre's European tour, he let himself into Russia. More specifically, he made it all the way to Moscow. This was impressive for a couple of reasons. One, because he had defeated other European powers with really little effort and he was about to defeat Russia. Finger quotes. About to defeat Russia. Back in the day, there was this notion that if you control the nation's capital, you win. Well, he had Moscow, but it was more of a Pyrrhic victory. Russia had enacted a military tactic called Scorched Earth, and it wouldn't be the last time they used it. Basically, back in the day, militaries relied heavily on the lands they took for resources, food, shelter, and supply lines. Well, you can't control that if there's no land to take. So Russia destroyed their land, food, fields, and really anything that would have been helpful along the way as they retreated. Also, the winters were very brutal and cold, and the French were not prepared. So mix that together and awkward. Number 5, the Battle of Mogadishu. Here's a modern one for you. It was a simple job. Grab 2 high-value targets, known collaborators of a corrupt Somali leader who's basically just a dictator. Things were going great until 2 $6 million Black Hawk helicopters were downed by enemies on the ground. An in-and-out operation that was supposed to last no longer than an hour. Tops, I swear, I promise. It actually turned out to be an overnight 16-hour rescue op that saw 18 Americans lose their life, known as the Black Hawk Down situation, or operation I guess. So what's the lesson on this one? Well, I'm not really sure to be honest, but what I do know is that it left a mark on 90s history and American military snafus. Number 4, Castle Itter. Okay, good guys wear one outfit, bad guys wear another. If the soldier in front of you sounds German and it's World War II, then it's probably the enemy. Chances are. It all makes sense, right? Well, the Battle of Castle Itter makes no sense. When World War II was coming to its climactic close, Americans and Allied forces were coming from the west, and all of Mother Russia was coming from the east. A lot of Germans fought to the bitter end, but the smart ones knew it was time to jump ship. You can see it was falling apart. And in the case of Castle Itter, they actually joined forces with Americans and allies to defend high-value prisoners from an SS detachment who still thought Germany could win. Spoiler alert, they could not win. It was over. And the joint force would see a victory. That's kind of cool. That's a cool story. Again, where's the movie of that? Where's the movie? Put me in the movie. Someone make me famous. Let's go. Hollywood directors, I'm talking to you. Number 3, Stirling Bridge. There was one time growing up I had a super important test to take at school. I don't remember what class it was, but I remember studying extra hard for it. I mean, seriously, I opened the books and I hit them hard, brother. Harder than my little heart could desire. Studied my little heart out. It was really hard, correct? And now I'm thinking about it, it's probably math. Anyway, well, when I went to bed, I knew that I was going to be ready for that test. The trouble is, I woke up at 9:57. School started at 8:30. Not only did I miss the test, but when I retook it, I didn't do as well as I thought. Well, this is the case of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, except there wasn't really any awkward high school stuff going on. It was more of a serious battle for independence. The very famous William Wallace and the Scottish were at odds with the English, as you'll find in history they do that. Well, that morning the British general slept in, and Wallace, seeing an opportunity, seized it, and seized the day and victory for Scotland. The lesson here? Set your alarm, folks. Don't miss the battle. Set your alarm. Number 2, Operation Cottage. Canada and the US have been friends for a very long time, and we will probably be friends for a very long time. We have apologized profusely for burning down the White House. We're sorry, eh? Didn't mean to do that, bud. I'm sorry there, guy. Sorry, friend. Jeez. However, did you know that in a classic World War II military snafu, Canadians and US soldiers fought each other? Kiska Island, Alaska. It had been occupied by a small group of Japanese forces, which is kind of a weird story on its own. How did that even happen? So we went to go kindly ask them to leave, as you do. Trouble is, when we got there, there were no Japanese, and in a very confusing battle after landing on 2 different points of the island, our 2 great nations fought each other where sadly lives were lost. It was rough. It was sad. It was like 30 Americans and like 4 Canadians. I don't know if we're just good shots or what. I don't know what it is, buddy. Number 1, Bull Run. The Civil War. It's the one that shaped America. Brother versus brother. And it's what your dad reads about in his spare time. I don't know, dads just do that. Bull Run is one of the most famous battles from the time. However, I don't want to focus on the battle itself, as I've nerded out too hard in history already today in this video. No! Why am I talking about this, and why is this in the number 1 spot? Well, that's because of spectators. Yes, that's right, spectators. Wealthy folks would often come to large battles like Bull Run on a decent vantage point out of the splash zone, literally, and view the ensuing horror that was the Civil War. And before you even ask, yes, they brought food and a picnic to enjoy the show. Maybe don't watch that. Just an idea. Next time. Yeah, oh well.
Starting with Hannibal Barbanable. I will either find a way or make one. Sounds like your mom when she's mad about something, doesn't it? It was first said by Hannibal Barca, the guy that led the Carthaginian army and has been named the father of strategy, since even the Roman armies who feared him incorporated elements of Hannibal's tactics into their own strategic arsenal. His use of chemistry, transportation inventions, war animals, strategic use of environmental factors, and battlefield tactics render him a military genius. His logistics and strategy allowed his armies to fight against forces much larger and better equipped than him. He held out and repelled all efforts to drive him out of Italy for half a generation. One of the greatest military feats was the crossing of the Alps with his army, which bypassed the Roman garrisons and naval strength. His army was around 100,000 strong, which consisted of cavalry, siege engines, and famously 37 war elephants. After crossing the Alps, his army had lost about 25% of its strength, and some even put the loss at around 50%. This became one of the most celebrated achievements of ancient warfare, and was followed by an epic pillage of Rome. For the rest of their history, the phrase "Hannibal is at the gates" was used by Roman senators whenever disaster struck. It was also used by parents to scare their children at night. Pee-wee? Nah, it's just Herman. And it really was, because Hermann Balk defeated an entire Soviet army where he was outnumbered 7-1 in tanks, 11-1 in infantry, and 20-1 in artillery. He started the war as a staff officer and ended at the German equivalent of a 3-star general. He was also one of the only 27 soldiers to earn the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, equivalent to 3 major honors in the US military. Sent to help retake Stalingrad, Balk found his entire division defended a 37-mile front with only 1 howitzer. He quickly maneuvered his units into a hammer, and as the Soviets prepared for their next attack, he let the heavy weaponry of his hammer fly, decimating 53 tanks and wiping out 1 Soviet tank corps. For 8 days straight, Balk held off Soviet firepower and pushed back. After 6 days of attrition, deception, and tactically astute defending, the entire Soviet 5th Tank Army had been wiped out. This defense earned his division the codename of Hannibal, after the great tactician. During the period from December 7th, 1942 until January 31st, 1943, the Hannibals were credited with their destroying of 225 tanks, 347 anti-tank weapons, 35 artillery pieces, and killing 30,700 Soviet soldiers. Balk's division losses for the same period were only 16 tanks, 12 anti-tank weapons, 1,017 injured, and only 215 killed. Now for the man who leaves nothing but rags, a legacy of conquers, and 4 swords. Give my message to all the cowards of the world that if there is death on the battlefield, then Abu Suleiman was not dying like an old camel. Those were the dying words of Abu Suleiman, another name for Khalid bin Walid, the Arabian commander born in 1952 Mecca. He conquered Iraq, Iran, Armenia, Jordan, Syria, Palestine, and a lot of lands in the Arabia, roughly fighting 100+ battles and aiding in defeating the Persian and Roman empires as well. His army was always less in quality and quantity, but he never lost. His first battle as a Muslim after his conversion in 627 AD was the Battle of Musa. He watched 3 commanders consecutively become martyred. So, using his powerful attack plan and taking charge, Khalid's success withdrew the remaining troop of 3,000 while 200,000 soldiers were attacking them. The story goes that Khalid broke 9 swords in that battle, and when he returned to the homeland with his men, citizens started throwing stones at them and shouting that they had left the battle like cowards. But the Prophet of Islam raised his hands and said that no one should dare talk bad about Khalid, as he is the one sword from the swords of Allah. Naturally, the first Khalifa appoints him a commander, but Khalid is later dismissed from his post on a sumptuary charge for giving an everyday poet 10,000 dinars from his own pocket. In 642 AD, when he died, he left behind 4 swords, ragged clothes, and a horse he fought battle on. Time shall never forget the man who conquered 70% of the land for the Muslims that reside there today. He will win who knows when to fight and when not to fight. That's right, baby, it's Art of War up next. Sun Tzu was a Chinese military strategist and general best known as the author of the work The Art of War, a treatise on the military strategy also known as the 13 chapters. The tactician lived, fought, and composed his work during the spring and autumn period preceding the warring states of 481 to 221 BCE. Good time to drop a book on war, I guess. When the king Ho Lu of Wu was duking it out in the Wu-Chu Wars of 512 to 506 BC, Ho Lu wanted to test Sun Tzu's skill and commitment before appointing him to lead as a general. Because writing the literal book on war, I guess, wasn't enough. So he commanded Sun to train his 180 concubines to be soldiers. Sun Tzu divided the harem in 2, and the king's favorites were made their commanders. His first order simple, just to turn right. The women laughed, not taking the exercise seriously, so he repeated himself, and again they laughed. So he had the 2 commanders beheaded and replaced. After that, the women obeyed his commands without hesitation, and the king hired him. The Boju victory is owed very much to this exact tactic of disciplining troops. The Chu forces were numerically superior to the Wu, and the king Ho Lu wanted to put off advancing on the field. General Fugai chose to act of his own accordance with Sun Tzu's strategic advice and gave the order to advance anyway. If the troops had hesitated and waited on orders of the king instead, they couldn't have driven the enemy from the field and captured the Chu capital of Ying. Meanwhile, in India, the Rajasthan Wranglers are in full force. The 3rd Mughal emperor, Akbar, consolidated his empire across India throughout a series of striking military victories, creating one of the most affluent empires of the age. From age 16, Bairam played an active role in the early Mughal conquests of India and established the Mughal Empire under Humayun. He was consigned with the position of Keeper of the Seals, and he also took part in military campaigns in Benares, Bengal, and Gujarat. After the death of Humayun in 1556, he was designated regent over the young monarch Akbar in the midst of the war against Sikandar Shah. Then, in November, he led the Mughal force at the second battle of Panipat fought between Akbar and Hamu. Upon reaching the age of 19 in 1560, Emperor Akbar finally gained sole power over the empire and told Bairam it's time to retire. His rise to the throne was very theatrical. He threw Bairam's replacement out of a window, which does thoroughly indicate to people to not F with him. In the years 1568 to 73, all of the Rajasthan and almost all of what we know now as Punjab, Pakistan, and central India, all the way to Bengal, had been conquered by the Mughals consecutively by Akbar's brain and Bairam's sword. The formidable warlord, nicknamed the Scourge of God, is next. Who was the most powerful warlord in the ancient world? Well, if we're talking Eurasia, it's definitely Attila, king of the nomadic horseman warrior tribe, the Huns. This man truly enjoyed enjoyed carnage and warfare, earning the nickname and fearsome reputation of Flagellum Dei, aka Scourge of God. Attila took the lead in 434 when his uncle died. He and his brother invaded and conquered the Balkans in 441, and by 443 they had pillaged their way to Constantinople. The Romans paid the Huns almost 2 tons of gold just to stop them pillaging, and they agreed to pay an annual tribute of about 1,500 pounds of gold to make them stay away. In 1445, Attila killed his brother Bleda. Apparently, Bleda wanted to kill him. The fact that he didn't invade the Roman Empire until 451, despite the hefty annual payment, was due to his personal friendship with Attius. In 450, however, the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III sent her engagement ring to Attila the Hun and asked him to save her from a forced marriage. Attila didn't really need another wife since he had plenty of them, but who was he to turn down a wedding proposal from a pretty lady? He heads over there to take her by force from them. This was one of the very few times Attila did not have a successful invasion. His friend Aetius actually luckily had the Roman Ostrogoths to help him drive Attila out, who then went to Italy in 452 to harass some popes instead. But just like Alexander the Great, Attila has a super odd death, and in 453, he dies in a drunken slumber, suffocating on the blood of his own nosebleed. The next 4 on our list, including this mighty admiral, apparently all had a 0% defeat rate, or money back guarantee. In the case of Admiral Yi Sun-shin of the Korean Navy, you're never getting your money back. He was never once defeated his whole career. To just get a sense of how brilliant Yi was, let's look at the strategy that won the Battle of Myeongnyang. Considered the most remarkable battle out of the 26 he participated in, and won. Before the battle, Yi's fleet of 130 was broken down to a measly 50 ships. Japanese adversaries approached with 130 ships, and Yi's obviously outnumbered like 10 to 1. Recognizing the importance of battlefield, Yi looked through various maps of Korea and found a narrow channel that's water flow change direction every 3 hours. He lured the Japanese back to the mouth of this channel, where they can see his puny forces and decide to charge. Yi's flagship charged straight back at them at battle speed, cannons firing alone and going against the violent water flow that was carrying the Japanese ships right up to Yi's to be crushed underneath like paper. As he had timed, the water flow direction then flipped, causing the Japanese ships to crash into each other. The strait's too narrow for them to recover, and Yi took the chance to also bombard them with cannonballs. In the end, Yi's tiny fleet had destroyed 31 ships and lost none. But it's not just the battles he won that proved his brilliance. He's also the first person to make a modified version of the famous hammer and anvil tactic to a naval battle. Keep in mind when I say first, it's because he'd never heard of Hannibal or the Greeks using it. So in this point of view, yeah, he thought he was the original creator. The anthem of this next legendary leader is definitely I want it, I got it. Whatever Bajirao set his eyes on, he won, and whoever got in his way was blown to smithereens. According to the British Army officer Bernard Montgomery, Bajirao was possibly the finest cavalry general ever produced in India. Bajirao's military course spanned 20 years, during which he fought 35 enemies, yet he never witnessed a defeat and always came home victorious. Chronologically, the battles of Malwa in 1723, Dar in 24, Aurungabad in 24 as well, the Battle of Palkad in 28, and Filzobad in 37 were some of the most important Peshwa Bajirao won and altered the course of history. He understood the importance of speed for operating in relatively plain terrains of northern India and adapted Mathura forces accordingly, and their weapons. No heavy artillery, not even cooks or supplies. Everyone would be given fixed cash to buy grains from local farmers, and they would eat the grain raw while riding the horse. After defeating Nizram in the Battle of Palkad in 1728, Bajirao turned his attention to Malwa. In October 1728, he consigned a huge army commanded by his younger brother Chimnaji Appa and aided by the generals Shindi, Holkar, and Palwar. By the 29th of November 1728, Chimnani's army defeated the Mughals. Bajirao would continue on to the Balkan Hand and the Gujarat campaigns, making way for the march to Delhi, and after that, evicting the exploitive Portuguese. Get ready for a hell of a rap sheet, because losing ain't an option for Alexander Savarov. Just to compare, Alexander the Great won 4 out of his 4 major battles. Julius Caesar won 7 of 8, and Napoleon lost only 5 of 74. Alexander fought in 63 major battles and won 63 major battles. His military career spanned 6 decades, including the 7-Year War and the Russo-Turkish Wars and a series of rebellions against the Russian monarchy. He served the Russian Empire under 4 different rulers. With his immense knowledge of tactics, equipment, strategy, and siege warfare, he was as renowned a military man not just in Russia, but all across Europe. In 1799, 1939, the French were occupying all of Italy, and the Austrians had lost their territory in northern Italy and called upon the Russians for assistance. Alexander waged a systematic campaign besieging cities, cutting off French garrisons, and defeating French armies. Several of the French Republic's best generals fell to him in that battle. Within just a couple months, the French were completely driven from Italy. Suvorov was prepared to march on Paris after this, but he was told to take his Russian troops into Switzerland and link up with a different Russian army, who sadly were defeated before he ever even arrived. The result that was he was surrounded by a French army of 80,000 instead. The worst part was he only had 20,000 men at his disposal. Any other general would have been doomed, not him. He expertly determined features of the Swiss landscape and maneuvered around the French troops, fighting off limited attacks, staying elusive, and eventually slipping through the mountains and back to the friendly territory. For this, Alexander was given the title of Generalissimo of Russia, the greatest Russian military man of his era, and he died a few months later. The right-hand man. Who is he? I hear about 99% of you saying right now. We've seen all the Khans, but we've yet to see Subutai. The right-hand man of Genghis Khan conquered more territory alone than any other leader on this list and in history itself. Genghis Khan himself had a few failed campaigns. Rommel, with all his talent and brains, was routed out of North Africa, and Alexander the G could not achieve his ultimate dream of conquering India. Bear in mind, homeboy Subutai didn't even rule a country. He was involved in 200 battles and around 180 were commanded by him, and he won every single one. He conquered 32 nations as the general of the army. Some of these include Russia, China, and most of Persia. Seriously, he conquered Russia and China, the former bane of Napoleon, never to be conquered again. And guess what? He fought all these battles in the winter. He crossed ice lakes and used them for roads. He's also remembered for devising a campaign that destroyed the armies of Hungary and Poland within 2 days of each other by forces 500 kilometers apart. He did a lot of his conquering at the age of 60 plus while having 4 princes as the generals of his armies. One desperately wanted him dead too. And then in 1241, as he was planning to invade the Holy Roman Empire, creating an empire so large it would have spanned over 2 continents, sadly, he passed away, ending his military career. Honestly, if he hadn't died, I'm positive Subtuai would have conquered all of Europe. Even without these achievements, he still goes down as the greatest military leader of all time.
Number 10, the Siege of Orleans. Or Orleans. As history would have it, the French and English were at each other's arms again. Oh, who would have thought? It's a very common trend in history, except this time, France was losing really badly, like super badly. So one day when a young peasant girl walked into the king's throne room and said, "Bro, I got this. A godly angel vision sent me here to fight back and rid France of the English." Running low on everything, including men, the king agreed. The Siege of Orleans was to be the final nail in the coffin for France until Joan of Arc showed up. She led the army to victory against the English. They were stunned and she became a hero overnight. It's a good thing not too long after that they burned her at the stake for being a witch. That nice? No, it's not nice, it's horrible. God, can't have anything nice. Number 9, the Battle of Waterloo. The Corsican ogre, Napoleon Bonaparte. His military career is most impressive, maybe the most impressive out of any military leader to have ever lived. You gotta watch a more detailed video of his battle plan, seriously, the guy's crazy. But in a nutshell, his tactics saw him win the day, time and time again, even though he was severely outnumbered by multiple European nations trying to take him down. Well, it seems his luck had finally run out because at Waterloo, he received his first major defeat, and ever since that, well, he was kind of on the run. He was forced to retreat. They had him on the run. Eventually, he would surrender and was banished. He came back to be a tyrant and then was banished a second time, even harder. And France kind of went back to being France and not dictator France. Number 8, the Battle of Gettysburg. The North versus South. A house divided amongst itself cannot stand. One fighting for a noble cause, the other fighting for a, well, not so noble cause. Up until the Battle of Gettysburg, the South had been winning tactful battle after tactful battle. They were kind of good. General Lee of the Confederacy was making his invasion of the North very notable. However, on July 1st, 1863, that's a couple years before Canada was born, the Battle of Gettysburg commenced, the largest and most costly battle of the war. The thing is, this time, it was a Union victory, and the Union used this momentum to carry themselves all the way back down south, and eventually to victory. Number 7, D-Day. June 6, 1944, Western Allies embarked on the journey that they have been striving for those many months. This plan amassed the largest amphibious attack in history, supported by a logistics operation large enough to supply a small country. Germany had constructed lines of defenses all along the coast of France. The Atlantic Wall, as it was called. It was going to be hard, and it was. American, British, and Canadian forces suffered many casualties, but after hours of fighting on the beach, they punched through and even further into German lines, Canadians making it the furthest on the first day. Why does this change everything? Well, because it gave Western Allies a massive forward operating base and a foothold in occupied Europe, effectively beginning to trap Germans between two large armies, the Western armies and the Soviet Union. Take that, Germany! Number 6. Stalingrad! All the way in the Eastern Front. None of this is pretty, but it's what happened. And no one paid the toll quite like the Soviet Union did. Germany marched into the Soviet Union by surprise, sending Stalin into a fit of rage. Germany got real close to Moscow, and in the process captured a stupid amount of POWs in the hundreds of thousands. It's crazy. However, when it came to Stalingrad, it wouldn't be so easy. A battle that lasted months. Civilians froze in the Russian cold and starved simply because the city was leveled, there was nothing left. After brutal urban combat, the Soviet Union began to push the Germans out, winning the Battle of Stalingrad, which honestly is more of a Pyrrhic victory, but this is when the Soviets began to reassemble their numbers, rebuild factories and buildings that had no walls or ceilings, and began the fight of pushing the Germans back to Berlin. It was the beginning of the end. Number 5. The Battle of Midway. Out in the Pacific Ocean, midway to Japan, one of the largest naval battles ever commenced. The Empire of Japan sent her best, as well as America sending hers. Aircraft carriers were sunk, planes at the bottom of the ocean, and when it was done, America was victorious. God bless America. More important than that, Japan had lost some of its key ships from its fleet and could no longer engage the US at sea in fear of losing what remained of their fleet. They just wouldn't match up. So Japan stopped in her tracks, dug in her heels in the middle of the jungles of the Pacific Islands, and dared anyone to come and find them. And that's just what the Marines were going to do, effectively beginning the island hopping campaign that the Pacific War became defined for. Number 4. Battle of the Marne. It's quite possible that World War I is the cause and effect for every major conflict since, and a lot of stuff on this list too. Some historians think that the Great War is responsible, so if that's the case, then look no further than the Marne. In a nutshell, European empires thought this war would just be a little titter-tatter, be home by Christmas sort of deal. They always say that. Well, after a bunch of maneuvering and meeting at the sea, the race to the sea as they called, it was time to ditch the blam-blams and reach for shovels and picks, as this is where everyone dug in and built trench systems that stretched miles, thousands of them. It would also be the start of the horrible trench warfare, all thanks to the Battle of the Marne. Number 3. The Battle of Quebec. The 7 Years' War was interesting to say the least, and some consider it to be the first global conflict. Kinda is. While not talked about a lot, there actually was a lot of conflict in Europe at the time, especially between Austria and the other European powers. However, for history class, what's most studied is the conflict in North America. Basically, it was a fight over who got North America and or the territories that were owned by each other. That's pretty much what it was a fight over. And for French Acadians, the Battle of Quebec would decide it all. Unfortunately, it ended in English victory, a large portion of Acadians moving south to what is now Louisiana, and lines on the maps changing drastically. The early borders of both what would become America and Canada. It also helped set the stage for the American Revolutionary War. Also cool, because now we have America. And they're cool, I like America. I love you, America. Oh, say can you see? Number 2, the Battle of Okinawa. Years of island hopping and trying to dig out Japanese forces from the Pacific Islands had left its mark on everyone. By 1945, Japan was getting desperate. Very desperate. Supply lines were running thin. Men were also thin because of supply shortages, and well, there just wasn't enough manpower to fight the oncoming Americans. Seemingly at every tropical step America took, Japan met them with full force. Okinawa was no different and was the last island worth defending before mainland Japan. So they fought fiercely, no mercy, and when the Marines came out of the jungle they knew what was next. Or at least so they thought. And number 1, Pearl Harbor. This is the battle that changed it all, folks. Japan suddenly attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Before this, America wasn't exactly neutral, as history tells it, as they had been supplying allies in Europe for cold hard cash, and they had embargoed Japan on their oil supplies. So no, not exactly neutral. However, they were fully convinced that they were not going to get involved. They learned their lesson from the Great War and had no interest in sending young men to fight in what was going to be the worst conflict in human history. So yeah, it kind of brought America into the whole thing.
History is full of nearly forgotten battles that shaped where we are now. Obviously, I like to start with the ones that are a more familiar story for us to warm up to. So that'd be how a teen solved an 100-year-old problem. That's right, Joan of Arc, baby. This delusional Bible thumper had visions of God and all sorts of beliefs that historians believe indicated hyper-religiosity, a psychiatric condition in which a person experiences intense religious beliefs or episodes that affect normal functions, logic, and behavior. Anyways, one day Joan heard the voices of a Christian saint telling her to aid Charles, the French Dauphin, in gaining the French throne and expelling the English. In May of 1428, she traveled to Vaucouleurs and told the captain of the garrison of her visions. He thinks she's nuts and sends her packing. But in January 1429, she annoys him enough to allow her passage to the Dauphin. Joan arrives in men's garbs with soldiers and has an audience with King Charles, who approves of her and set her off on her divine mission, rallying the citizenry, suggesting tactical decisions, and participating in battle. The French retook the banks of the Loire River and Orleans and defeated the invaders. Many say the battle saved France from centuries of English rule. Next up, let's meet the man who beat the Mongols. This is the Battle of Anjalou of 1260. The Mamluks ruled most of Egypt and the majority of the Fertility Crescent, so they were quite pissed when the Mongols came in and snatched Baghdad in 58. A year later, in 1259, the Mongols moved into Syria and Aleppo, at Damascus and Aleppo, and the shores of the Mediterranean. Naturally, they're feeling pretty confident, so they send an envoy to Cairo in 1260 and demand the submission of Sultan Muzaffar al-Din Quwad, whose reply was the execution of said envoy, and so the war was the only answer, I guess. With the army led by Quds, the Mamluks defeated a small Mongolian force at Gaza and then come up against an army of about 20,000 at Anjalou. This is where King David smote Goliath in the Book of Samuels. No worries though, the Mamluks general was a former fugitive, he'd been in that area a lot, and reputably drew up a battle strategy for the land, copying the Mongols' most successful tactic, feigned retreat. The strategy worked like a charm, and even when the Mongols swarmed from all sides, broke their left wing, the Sultan Qutuz tossed his helmet and screamed for the men to fight in the name of Islam and their love, a speech that motivates the men to gain the upper hand. The Mongol general is then taken prisoner by the Mamluks, and he declared defiantly that Khan would inflict savage revenge for this defeat, so they beheaded him on the battlefield. The remaining Mongols had began to retreat. The Mamluks pursued them for 8 miles to cut them down. The Mongol Empire was thus contained to Iran and Mesopotamia and spread no further. Off to visit our Nordic friends to learn how the Swede supremacy ended. Very few wars shook up the European power structure more than the Great Northern Wars of the 1700s, the whole purpose of which was the Baltic armies teaming up with the pure goal of ending Swedish reign in the region. Apparently they sucked and nobody liked them, but thank you for IKEA and the meatballs. Sweden beat all these armies repetitively until 1709. The Swedish invasion of Russia had already failed the previous winter from their loss of major supply column and their failure to receive expected reinforcements. Despite the severe shortages of troops, artillery, and powder, Charles continued the war and besieged Podvala in May. Charles planned to charge past the Russian line of redoubts without stopping to subdue them and directly target the main Russian defensive position. This called for extreme mobility and daring, two things Charles didn't have since he was hella injured. The Swedish attack faltered and the Russian counterattack with 40,000 troops killed and captured the entire Swedish army, except for Charles and 1,500 followers who escaped. Charles was wounded and after the attack handed the command over to a subordinate, and his subsequent counterattack went terribly, resulting in the decimation of a third of Swedish armies, along with the loss of the battle, the war, and Swedish supremacy. How about a family at war? Cleo and the Ptolemies. We all know about Cleo's dramatic snake venom ending, but how about her bloody beginning? It starts when her father dies. Cleo's younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, is heir to the throne. Due to him being 11, a regent's appointed for him, who, with some other court officials, form a close-knit group with the young Ptolemy and feed him insecurity and conspiracy towards his sister, the ambitious and intelligent 18-year-old Cleo. What if she tried to usurp him for the crown, after all? So in 48 BC, this group, fearful of her ambition and power, exiles her when she refuses to marry her younger brother. Cleopatra flees to Syria, intending to raise an army and return as ruler of Egypt. Julius Caesar calls these two siblings to his palace and tries to mediate. This is when Cleo gets the idea idea to seduce him and starts hooking up with Caesar. The two snatch the throne alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, and then much later after Caesar's slaying, when Cleo and her son Caesarion flee back to Egypt, Cleo then kills Ptolemy XIV, the other younger brother, so Caesarion can be on the throne. She also had a younger sister, Arinso, who helped conduct the siege of Alexandria against Cleo, so she killed her too in 41 BC. Naturally, this is when Mark comes in, stepping stone of the War of Atticum that lasted from 32 to 30 BC, where Octavian and Mark Antony duke it out over Rome and Egypt. After a decisive win for Octavian, Cleo and Antony withdrew to Alexandria. Octavian besieged the city until both of them took their own lives, and Egypt was conquered. Now for the Silk Road Throwdown. Ever wonder why the Chinese philosophers were so incredibly talented and ingenuitive when it came to building weapons and machinery, creating things the Greeks and the Ottomans could only dream of, yet they didn't conquer more of the world? Few people today have heard of the Battle of Talas River, a double-cross caused it. In 750, the king of Ferghana had a border dispute with the ruling neighbor of Chot. He appealed to the Chinese general Cao for assistance, and Cao besieged Chot and offered the Chochan king safe passage out of the capital. Once he did, he beheaded him. Naturally, news gets back to the Abbasid governor, who rallies the troops. Somewhere in present-day Kazakhstan, armies of the Abbasid Caliphate met those of the Chinese Tang dynasty. Chinese records state that the Tang army was 30,000 strong, while the Arab accounts put the number of the Chinese at 100,000. For 5 days, these mighty armies clashed. Then the Karluk Turks came in on the Arab side several days into the fighting, and the Tang's army's doom is sealed. Chinese sources imply the Karlaks had been fighting for them originally, but treacherously switched sides midway through the battle. None of the combatants could have predicted that this battle would be instrumental in transmitting a key invention from China to the Western world, the art of paper making, a technology that would alter world history forever. And did you guys know that this war was the first global conflict? The 7-Year War, colonizers fighting colonizers over land that isn't theirs to begin with. It starts with unresolved disputes. France claims Canada and the Great Lakes, and then the eastern seaboard was claimed by the Brits, who want more, and it causes skirmishes and political disputes. Meanwhile, Prussia preemptively annexed the state of Saxony in anticipation of war, which pisses off all of Europe and the Holy Roman Empire. Then the Russian Empire, fearing Prussia could turn on neighboring Poland and Lithuania, went against Prussia. 1756 saw the war officially declared against the French by the British, and now the 7-Year War began in earnest. Ironically, it's Russia's Empress Elizabeth dying that starts the end of the BS. Her successor pulls the Russian troops back and mediates the Prussia-Sweden truce. This is the same year Spain is pulled in on the French-Aussie side. Meanwhile, Britain is quite literally busy colonizing the ever-loving crap out of everywhere, while France was distracted from doing so. So they win India, the Philippines, Cuba, Galapagos, Martinique, and Senegal. In 1763, it was clear that Austria would not regain what they wanted from Prussia, which was its main goal throughout the war, so they just tapped out, and everyone just kinda stopped. The end of the war was the Treaty of Hubertsburg, signed on the 15th of February, and the Treaty of Paris, signed 5 days earlier. Essentially, to summarize, the treaties that they signed was everyone dividing up colonized land that didn't belong to any of them. And now we'll be touring the tours. Be careful who you ally yourself with. Eudes the Great learned the hard way. Having been threatened by both the Arabs in the south and the Franks in the north, he forms an alliance in 730 with the Uthman Nasira, the Berber emir. Yeah, 1 year later, Uthman rebels against the governor, and the governor Abdir Rahman quickly crushed the revolt, executed everyone, and turned his focus onto anyone Uthman ever allied with. Oopsies, that's Eudes. So, the Duke had enough warning of the coming siege and collected his army at Bordeaux, but they were easily defeated, and Bordeaux plundered as well as areas of Gaul. Eudes then appeals to Franks for assistance, which Charles the Hammer Martel only granted after they agreed to submit to Frankish authority. Charles arrives at the battleground first in 732, and for 6 days the two armies sort of just watch each other with minor skirmishes. Rama's men wait for their full strength to arrive, and when they did, chaos ensued, but it only lasted 1 day. Apparently, a rumor reached the Arab army that Charles had sent scouts to cause chaos in the Muslim base camp. Charles's hope was to draw off part of the foe, and it succeeded. Tons of the Muslim cavalry booked it back to camp. To this, the rest of the Muslim army, it looked like a full-scale retreat was happening, so they all started running too. Then their leader, Rahman, gets killed. So how does this change history? Many scholars have argued that if Rahman had prevailed, which he would have without Martel's trickery, the dominant religion of Europe today would be Muslim. Let's change history for the better. Cruelty to piety. In the words of archaeologist and scholar Ramesh Prasad Mohapatra, no war in history of India is as important either for its intensity or the results as the Kalinga War of Ashoka. No war in the annals of human history have ever changed the heart of a victor, from one of wanton cruelty to that of exemplary piety as this one. Enticed? You better be. In an attempt to conquer the southeastern and south parts of India, which would result in the Mauryan Empire becoming the largest empire in the country, Ashoka waged a war against the ruler of Kalinga in 200 961 BC. Kalinga had a sound geographical location with trade routes leading to South Asia, and import ports along a strong navy. A powerful state on the fringe of the Mauryan Empire would be problematic as it could disrupt the communication lines between the Mauryan capital and the Pataliputra and its holdings in the central Indian peninsula. The conflict spanned most of the Indian subcontinent south of the Himalayas and the coastal state of Kalinga, costing as many as 300,000 to 1 million lives. This had a shocking effect on Ashoka and makes him be the only would-be dictator on the verge of glory to just walk away. Ashoka devoted the rest of his life to non-violence and victory through karma as a Buddhist, ending the military expansion of the empire and beginning an era of more than 40 years of relative peace, harmony, and prosperity. In the long run, it did cripple the empire's ability to defend itself from external threats, one of the factors that led to the eventual fall of the Mauryan Empire following his death. But another interfamily battle with Macedonic madness, the Succession Wars. This family shows how a little nookie can go a long way. So Alexander the Great's father, Philip II of Macedon, probably had about 7 wives who all wanted to see their child installed on the throne, including Alexander's mother, Olympias. This starts the Succession War. Ancient historians are like 99.9% sure Olympias had something to do with Philip II's death via bodyguard in 1336 BC. Ancient historian Cleitocarachus also notes the bodyguard was a former lover of Philip II, who had taunted the king's newer younger lover into taking his own life. Yay. And Philip II's uncle-in-law allegedly forces himself on said bodyguard, making his brain kinda snap, and the bodyguard in retaliation kills his own ex, Philip II, in revenge. You following? It's believed Olympias is the one who snuck him into Philip's chamber. Whatever really happened, the Macedonian family's dysfunction doesn't end there. Alexander quickly started putting rival family members to death to secure his ascension, especially now that the throne was just wide open for the taking. And Olympias had Philip II's last wife, offspring, sneakily disposed of. After Alexander died in 232 BC, which might have been from alcoholism by the way, leaving a pregnant wife but no heir, his disabled half-brother is installed on the throne. The half-brother Philip III's wife, Eurydice, was essentially a beard for the mentally absent king and attempted to turn this figurehead into a real ruler. This put her in competition with Olympias. Ultimately, Philip is executed on Olympias' order, and then Olympias is caught and stoned to death by relatives of people she's killed, and this whole lineage came to a crumbling end. And to end it off, 2 battles, 1 won, 1 lost at the same time. An unnoble slaughter and the warring brothers. Plot A, Inca king Huayna Capac dies and decided to just leave his kingdom to his 2 sons, half-brothers Atahualpa and Huascar, who have 0 in common and can't seem to lead together, so naturally, war! Okay, plot B. While the bros are duking it out with each other, an absolute scum of the earth colonizer named Francisco Pizarro heard the news of riches in the mountain. They send a messenger through to the emissaries of Ata, who at the time was sweeping the floor with his brother Hua. He accepted the proposal to meet the leader from a foreign land. Plot A again. In 1532, Ata's army finally defeats Hua's outside of Cusco. News of this victory reached Ata, who was in the city of Cajamarca. At the time, sightings of strange white-skinned men with wool on their faces were reported as well. This is where Ata, now king, had agreed to meet the foreigners. A and B plot now conjoin. Spaniards have surrounded the city with their weapons, and Ata brings 80,000 people alongside him, mostly unarmed. Hiding Spaniards send a friar to Ata, who doesn't speak a lick of any language but his own, and ask him to accept Christianity. Hand him a Bible. Naturally, he has no idea what he's doing, so he hands it back. Well, that means he doesn't accept Christianity, so he deserves to die, and so does everyone else. The Spanish descend on the vastly unarmed crowd and start cutting everybody down. The conquistadors captured Ata and held him for ransom, who still makes sure to tell everyone, yo, execute my brother, execute him. Ata wouldn't outlive Hua by much. The Spanish do execute him as well in 1533, even after the Incas paid the ransom. Because colonization has never been about spreading the good word of religion, it's always been about theft and greed. If these brothers hadn't been warring when the Spanish arrived, things would be very, very, very different now.
Number 10, the Swiss Last Stand. Guys, this list taught me a lot of things, but one thing stands out above the rest. We are so freaking soft, like so damn soft. I have never, nor will I probably, who knows, ever face certain death willingly, like these people did. Lutheran mercenaries on May 6, 1527 were pillaging across northern Italy, and finally they made it to Rome. They made straight for Vatican Hill, and Pope Clement VII was on the hit list. While he was being smuggled out of Rome, 189 Swiss guards stood up against 20,000 bloodthirsty and angry troops. They formed a fighting square, and based on numbers alone, what should have been a quick victory turned into an all-day battle. The Swiss troops managed to beat back wave after wave of troops. When their swords dulled, they fought with daggers. When the daggers got lost, they fought with fists and teeth. It just went on and on. Sadly, they were taken down to the very last man, but their perseverance and courage still stand against the test of time.
Number 9, the Battle of Hastings. Winding the clocks back to 1066 to the Battle of Hastings, this one went down in East Sussex, England, and it happened in the middle of October, so why not include this one in the list? This battle was fought between the Norman-French army of William, Duke of Normandy, and the English army under the command of King Harold Godwinson. This kicked off the Norman conquest of England. According to William the Conqueror, the previous king of England, Edward the Confessor, originally promised the crown to William. He promised him the crown, but right before he passed away, the guy was on his deathbed and he literally changed his mind. How rude. Instead, he passed the crown on to Harold Godwinson. So William, yeah, he was a tad upset at this point. So he and his forces defeated Godwinson, went right into London, and became England's first Norman king. Epic.
Number 8, Vimy Ridge. I learned about this in school and my history teacher was so excited to tell me about it, and I'm still excited about it today. This battle is the reason Canadian soldiers earned their notoriety during World War I. The Battle of Vimy Ridge remains a testament to expert organization and strategy. From April 9th to 12th in 1917, 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps captured Vimy Ridge from the Germans, making the largest territorial advance made by any Allied force in the war. The losses were significant, resulting in 10,000 men either killed or wounded, so it wasn't the easiest win. However, through their meticulous planning and secret operations, they were able to break the stalemate between the Allied and enemy forces. Soldiers, before they were sent over, actually trained on a replica of Vimy Ridge, so they were like well rehearsed when they showed up. They knew Vimy Ridge like the back of their hand. Meanwhile, at Vimy Ridge, 11 tunnels were constructed in secret to bring the first wave out safely in front of German lines. Each tunnel was also equipped with lighting, water supplies, and first aid. Behind front lines, the soldiers moved in well-rehearsed timed attacks based on where Allied and enemy trenches were marked. Vimy Ridge marked a change in military tactic and highlighted the heroic nature of Canadian soldiers. Yeah, Vimy Ridge is kind of like a big deal over here. It's kind of cool. It wasn't just Canadians, they were like British soldiers too. But, you know, take it where you can get it.
Number 7, the Siege of Orleans. 1429. This battle marked the first major military victory for the French Royal Army following their defeat 30 years prior at the Battle of Agincourt. The Siege of Orleans is noted mostly for the involvement of Joan of Arc. This was during the late stages of the 100-year war between England and France. For about 6 months, the English was winning, but 9 days after Joan of Arc's arrival, the siege collapsed. Joan of Arc was just 17 years old also during this battle. But even before this, when she was just 12 or 13, she started to hear voices apparently from God. She saw these visions as well, and during her trial, she testified that saints and angels told her to go to church, to live a good life, and to also establish Charles VII to the French throne and be the country's rightful king. Not a bad tip-off from the God Squad. Now, while she did command the army at a young age, Joan of Arc didn't actually participate in combat. She did outline strategies and inspire troops, and also she was famous for her temper. That's pretty epic.
Number 6, the Winter War. The Winter War during World War II is not spoken of often, despite it being kind of incredible. Stalin was looking to expand his territory and had long wanted a reason to take over Finland, and so they invaded. Vastly outnumbered and outgunned, Finland should have fallen, but they didn't. One reason is that they were fighting on their turf, and 2, a man named Simo Häyhä. Marshal Carl Gustaf Mannerheim created a complex network of concrete bunkers, trenches, and fortifications that discouraged tank attacks by the Russians. The Finnish also used their skis to take out men through like lightning fast hit and run attacks. But Simo Häyhä made the Soviets shake in their boots. He was credited for over 500 kills within 100 days, despite being a humble farmer. He became known as the White Death and was one of the reasons that in just 3 months, Russia suffered 300,000 casualties while Finland sat at 65,000. Wow.
Number 5, the Battle of Marathon. Every New Year's Eve, there's always a guy on Facebook who just becomes a runner all of a sudden. They have the squirt water belt, the whole thing, they train for a marathon. But what is a marathon? Was it a person? Is it just a name for 42 kilometers? Well, it was a battle back in 490 BC between ancient Greeks and Persian invaders sent by King Darius. The Persians arrived to Marathon, about 20,000 of them. They arrived to punish the Greeks for supporting the Ionians who revolted against the Persians. The Greeks were outnumbered greatly, but they attacked hard and fast, and they took out 6,000 Persians, and eventually they just fled entirely. The number of Greek fighters lost was only around 200, so far less casualties. The story of Philippides came to be at this time. He ran the first ever marathon. He ran all the way from Marathon to Athens to deliver messages. BBM wasn't a thing back then, so he just had to blow his kneecaps out 6 times a day. He was one of the Greek military men known as the day-long runners. He did 6 marathons back to back, basically. Meanwhile, my uncle on Facebook's like, #runnerlife. Okay, no, next, delete.
Number 4, the Battle of Waterloo. Fun fact, in grade 10, my classmate and I reenacted the Napoleonic Wars with breakfast sandwiches that we made and brought to class. We got an A! Anyways, the Napoleonic Wars lasted between 1803 to 1815 and led to the deaths of over 5 million people. But after only 9 hours of bloodshed next to the Belgian town of Waterloo, the world changed forever. This moment in history marked the end of Napoleon's attempt at conquering Europe. On June 18th, 1815, Allied forces composed of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German thwarted Napoleon's attack. Thanks to them, Napoleon was left singing, "Waterloo, I was defeated and you won the war." ABBA. It paved the way for the powers today, lending a pathway for the British to become a global power, good and bad. Demand for American war supplies was crucial during the Napoleonic Wars as they remained neutral. Britain somewhat got in the way of the trading, but the Europeans' need for American cotton and grain became a higher importance, therefore establishing America as like a power. Now there was a lot of bloodshed behind the scenes here, as we know from colonialism in general, though it is clear that this battle changed the course of history for more good and bad to arise.
We have to include one of the most important battles of World War II on this list. We've seen this one on screen now numerous times. Every time I watch Saving Private Ryan, I don't breathe for that entire beach sequence. I couldn't even imagine what that must have been like in real life. Beginning on June 6, 1944, 156,000 American, Canadian, and British troops arrived at 5 beaches along the coast of France's Normandy region. Before the invasion, the Allied forces made this large-scale campaign, a deceptive one, in order to mislead the Germans. Come August, most of northern France was liberated, and not long after the Germans were defeated. Historians referred to this battle as the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. The late Ray Lambert, who recently passed in April at age 100, was an army medic during D-Day. His unit was sent to Normandy that June, and Ray Lambert saved 15 lives that day, despite having a broken back himself. He would drag injured men from the water to the secure small area behind this concrete block. He was 23 during D-Day as well. I'll save you the math. At the 75th anniversary ceremony of D-Day, that same block was named Ray's Rock and has a plaque on it honoring Lambert and his men.
Number 2, 300. Yeah, it was real. If you've seen the movie and the abundance of rippling pectorals, then you have heard of 300. But no, it wasn't just a movie, it happened, but the 300 was actually more like 4,000. But still, when you put it side by side to the massive hordes of enemies they faced, it might as well be 300. The Battle of 300 refers to the actual Battle of Thermopylae. King Leonidas was raised as roughly and brutally as depicted in the film, perhaps even harsher, so when horsemen from the east appeared in 481 BC as messengers from the god King Xerxes of Persia, he knew what he was to face. They demanded land and water, aka obedience to the empire, but instead of just Spartans, Athens and Sparta decided to form an alliance. It was suggested that they block the narrow passage, the hot gates, of the Thermopylae coast. The Spartans and Greeks faced over 150,000 Persian soldiers, and despite fierce fighting, they did lose. However, the battle remains one of the most famous in Greek history, not because they lost, but because of the testament of courage that stood against thousands.
And coming in at number 1, the Battle of Yorktown. Well, the surrender at Yorktown, rather. On this day, October 19, 1781, the Americans defeated the British at Yorktown, Virginia. British General Lord Cornwallis had to surrender about 8,000 soldiers, bringing an end to the American Revolution. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, famously killed in a duel with Aaron Burr. If you have Disney Plus, go watch the musical Hamilton, because you'll be dancing your way through history lessons in no time. According to historian and author of Alexander Hamilton, The Formative Years, Hamilton had a genius and was working hard, but did not come from an illustrious family like most of the founding fathers. He knew that winning glory in battle would make him famous and therefore help him further his career. Seriously, if you haven't seen Hamilton, I implore you to dive in tonight. It is the anniversary. What else do you have going on? Let's do it.